On the morning of my only son Mateo's wedding, I was not treated as the mother of the groom, but as the last piece of a puzzle that needed to be discarded for the final picture to be perfect. Locked in the guest room of that cold mansion in a gated community in Houston, Texas, the silence was so heavy it seemed to have shape and color. I could smell the expensive lilies wafting up from downstairs, a fragrance that should have symbolized purity and celebration, but which for me became the aroma of my own social funeral, of the death of my identity. In one hand, I held a clump of my gray hair, the only physical proof that it had once existed, and in the other, a note written in an elegant and cruel script, as sharp as the object they had used on me while I slept. The cold breeze from the air conditioning touched my now exposed scalp, and each shiver was a new wave of humiliation that coursed through my entire being. There, before the mirror that reflected a stranger, a bald woman with the sunken eyes of someone who has cried every tear she had, I did not feel hatred. I did not feel the urge to scream. What was born in me was a terrifying clarity, a calm that only arrives when you have lost absolutely everything. They believed that by stripping me of my appearance, they would have broken me completely. But in that deafening silence, as the sound of musicians tuning their instruments for the ceremony reached me like an echo from a world to which I no longer belonged, I understood. They had not destroyed me. They had freed me. And with the serenity of someone with nothing left to lose, I began to plan not revenge, but my resurrection. If you love Jesus and believe this story will teach us something, subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes of Stories of Healing and Wisdom. Your subscription is an act of faith in your own transformation. I ask you to join our community of souls who have gone through something similar. The awakening was slow, a painful return from a heavy sleep that, I suspected, had not been entirely natural. The first thing I noticed was the fabric of the sheets. An Egyptian cotton of such a high thread it felt like liquid silk against my skin. A luxury that was never mine, and that had always made me feel like an imposter. The second was the strange, persistent, cool breeze on the back of my neck and the top of my head, despite there being no open windows in the room. I opened my eyes to the ornate ceiling, with its plaster arabesques mimicking a European style that had nothing to do with the Texan plain outside. For a moment, confusion shielded me from reality. I thought perhaps I had dreamed it, a vivid and cruel nightmare. I raised my hand to scratch my head, an automatic gesture upon waking, and my fingers found nothing, just skin, smooth, cold, and terribly bare. Panic rose in my throat like hot bile. I threw the covers aside with a strength I didn't know I possessed and ran to the adjoining bathroom, a room larger than my old living room, all Carrara marble and gold fixtures. And there, in the immense mirror that covered the entire wall above the double sinks, I saw it. It was not me. It was a caricature of pain, a fragile and devastated figure, the silk pajamas they had given me as a gift hanging on my thin body, and my head shaved irregularly, as if done with haste and contempt. Tufts were missing in some places, and the skin was irritated in others. It was the image of sickness, of shame, of annihilation. It was the exact image she wanted to create. I stumbled back into the room, leaning on the expensive furniture to keep from falling. My heart was pounding erratically, a drum of panic and desolation. It was then that I saw it, resting on the pillow where my head had been. A small card, of thick textured paper, with my name, Carmen, written in impeccable calligraphy, the same script as the wedding invitations I had helped to address. My hands trembled so much I could barely pick it up. Each letter seemed to have been drawn with poison. The message was short, but each word was a calculated stab designed to hit the deepest part of my soul. Now you look sick. At least it matches your old soul. Don't ruin my wedding. I read the words once, twice, 10 times. The word sick seemed to leap off the page, stamping me with a diagnosis that was not medical, but social. She didn't just see me as old or a burden. She saw me as a disease, something that needed to be hidden, contained so as not to contaminate her immaculate happiness. The coldness of those words was the essence of Isabella. There was no room for interpretation. It was the final declaration that, in this empire of appearances she was building, there was no place for the woman who gave life to her future husband. The humiliation was not just in the absence of my hair, but in the documented intent, in the proof that my pain had been planned and executed with the same care she had chosen the flowers, and the menu for the party. That note was my sentence of exclusion. My entire body gave way. I collapsed onto the floor, onto the Persian rug whose complex pattern suddenly seemed to mock the simplicity of my pain. I curled up, hugging my own knees, in a futile attempt to protect myself from the world, to become so small that no one could see me, that no one could hurt me anymore. The tears didn't come. It was a state of shock so profound that my tears seemed to have frozen at the source. My only decision, clear and absolute in that moment, was to obey. I would not ruin her wedding. I would simply disappear. I would stay in that room, that gilded prison, until everyone had gone. I would become the dirty secret under the rug, the madwoman in the attic, the mother who was not worthy of being seen. I covered my head with my hands, as if that could make the hair grow back, as if I could hide my shame from myself. The distant sound of a harp beginning to play in the garden struck me like a physical blow, the announcement that the celebration of my invisibility was about to begin. I would stay there, quietly, and die a little inside, in silence. But the soft, metallic sound of the doorknob turning announced that my isolation was about to be broken. My life wasn't always this golden, oppressive silence. There was a time when the walls of my house breathed, when the air was thick with the smell of beans simmering slowly and the constant hum of my old Singer sewing machine. A sound. That was the soundtrack to our struggle and our happiness. My late husband, Santiago, and I built our small world in an immigrant neighborhood in Houston, a modest house with a backyard where he grew the sweetest tomatoes and the hottest peppers in Texas. We were a team. He worked in construction, under a relentless sun, and his hands, thick and calloused, were the same ones that held mine with a tenderness that disarmed me every night. I sewed for the neighborhood, mending work uniforms, making quinceañera dresses, turning scraps into quilts that told stories. Our only son, Mateo, grew up in this environment of hard work and palpable love. He was our great bet, our project for a better life. Every dollar we saved, every extra hour we worked, was deposited into an invisible account called Mateo's future. We wanted him to have the opportunities we never had, for his brilliant mind to take him beyond scaffolds and sewing machines. He was a good, affectionate boy who brought me flowers from our garden and promised that one day he would give me a castle. I would laugh and say that I already had my kingdom, right there, in that little house full of noise, smells, and love. I never imagined that one day he would indeed give me a castle, but that I would live in it as a prisoner. When Santiago was gone, taken by a heart that worked too hard and rested too little, the world lost its color. The hum of my singer fell silent for months. The house, once our refuge, became a mausoleum of memories. But in the midst of that overwhelming grief, the dream we shared for Mateo became my only reason to live. He had been accepted into one of the best architecture universities in the country, an achievement that filled my chest with a pride that ached. But the cost was astronomical, far beyond anything I could pay with my sewing. That's when I made the hardest decision of my life. I announced the sale of our house. Mateo protested, said he would get a job, that we would find a way, but I saw the future shining in his eyes, and I would not allow a lack of money to extinguish that light. I sold our kingdom for a fraction of what it was worth in memories. Every room I emptied was a part of me that I tore away. The scent of Santiago that still lingered in his closet, Mateo's height marks on the kitchen doorframe, the tomato garden that withered in sadness along with me. I handed the key to strangers and moved into a tiny apartment, using every penny to pay for my son's education. I told myself that bricks and cement were not a home. Home was where my son was. It was a lie I needed to tell myself to survive, a lie that time would brutally expose. I gave him his future, not knowing that in return, I was surrendering my past and, eventually, my own dignity. Matteo graduated with honors, a talented and promising architect. And then he met Isabella. At first, I was delighted. She was stunning, intelligent, from a wealthy and influential family that could open every door for my son. I welcomed her with open arms, believing she was the reward for all our sacrifices. She called me Mama Carmen, brought me expensive gifts, and praised my cooking, even though I could see in her eyes that she felt like she was at a zoo, observing the customs of an exotic species. The change was subtle, a slow and steady erosion. First, it was the helpful comments about my clothes, then about my accent. When Matteo announced they were getting married and that I would live with them in the mansion they were building, I felt a chill. The house was a work of modern art, with glass walls, soaring ceilings, and an aseptic silence. There was no room for my colorful quilts or my saints. I became a piece of living furniture, a curiosity from my son's humble past. Isabella began to control my interactions, to filter my stories, to edit me. I saw my son pulling away, his manner of speaking changing, his hugs becoming quicker and less tight. He was mesmerized by the world, of luxury and power she represented. And I, the personification of his poor past, was a dissonance that needed to be silenced. The first time she humiliated me publicly, I felt the floor disappear from under my feet. It was during a dinner with some of her friends, all of them wealthy, dressed with an elegance that made me feel invisible. I was nervous, but I tried to join the conversation, telling a funny story about a street party in my old neighborhood. In the middle of my sentence, Isabella let out a loud, artificial laugh, placing her hand on my arm. "Oh, Mama, you and your folktales," she said, with a smile that didn't reach her icy eyes. "It's fascinating to hear about that world, almost like a documentary. It's a good thing Matteo managed to get you out of there and give you the comfort you deserve." The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone at the table looked at me with a mixture of pity and embarrassment. My face was burning. She hadn't just interrupted me. She had reduced me to an object of study, a relic of a primitive life that they, the civilized, could observe from a distance. I looked at Matteo, searching for help, a glance, anything to tell me I wasn't alone. But he just took a sip of his wine, his gaze fixed on his plate, his face a mask of neutrality. In that moment, he was not my son. He was Isabella's husband, and I understood that to belong to his new world, I would have to accept being a nobody. The food lost its taste, and I spent the rest of the night in silence, feeling the pitying stares on me, as heavy as a shroud. The second time was even crueler, because it was calculated to wound me in my dependent state. Isabella insisted on taking me clothes shopping at one of those luxury boutiques where each item cost more than I earned in a year of sewing. I felt deeply uncomfortable, touching the fabrics as if I might soil them. I picked up a simple dress and looked at the tag. The price made me flinch as if I'd been shocked. Isabella, who was watching everything with an air of impatience, rolled her eyes. "Carmen, for God's sake, stop looking at the prices. It's so vulgar," she said loudly, drawing the attention of the slender saleswoman who was watching us. I felt my face flush violently. "Remember that you are an investment now. Your appearance reflects on us." As if that weren't enough, she leaned in and whispered with a venomous smile, "Consider this a payment for being an extra mouth to feed. The least you can do is look presentable." The phrase extra mouth to feed echoed in my head. It was a precise and vicious blow. She didn't see me as her fiancé's mother, but as a burden, an expensive pet that needed to be maintained. The saleswoman pretended to arrange some clothes, but I saw the glint of contempt in her eyes. I was the poor old woman living on charity. I left the store wearing humiliation like a heavy coat, carrying bags that contained much more than clothes. They contained the price of my dignity. That night, I cried silently in my room, a muffled cry so as not to disturb the owners of the house. The years that followed were a slow erasure of who I was. I became an expert in silences, in walking on tiptoes, in making myself small so as not to take up too much space. The joy that once defined me was replaced by a constant anxiety. I began to lose weight, and my hair, which had always been my pride, started to fall out in clumps, a physical manifestation of the sadness that was consuming me. Mateo saw or pretended not to see. He was too busy building his career, living the life that Isabella meticulously planned for him. Our conversations became superficial, exchanges of monologues where he talked about his projects and I just nodded. He stopped asking me how I felt, perhaps for fear of the answer. I felt like a plant forgotten in a dark corner of the house, slowly withering, without anyone noticing. Sometimes, I would look in the mirror and not recognize the sad-eyed woman who stared back at me. Where was the Carmen who laughed loudly, who danced in the kitchen, who faced the world with courage? She had been buried under layers of marble, silk, and contempt. I thought they had already taken my house, my memories, and my son. But that morning, seeing my bald and desolate reflection in the mirror, I understood that their cruelty was a bottomless pit, and that they would only stop when there was absolutely nothing left of me. The door burst open, and my son's figure filled the frame, silhouetted against the light of the hallway. Mateo was impeccable in his dark, tailored suit, his hair perfectly coiffed, a white flower on his lapel. For an instant, he was the image of the success that his father and I had dreamed of for him. But there was a line of impatience on his forehead, a haste in his gesture. "Mom, what's going on? Everyone is waiting. Isabella is a nervous wreck," he began, his voice laden with an urgency that was not for me, but for her. Then his eyes adjusted to the dimness of the room and finally found me. A figure huddled on the floor. The impatience on his face dissolved, replaced by a genuine confusion. "Mom?" he asked, his voice now lower, uncertain. He approached, and that's when he saw my head. I saw the shock register on his face, total disbelief. His knees gave way and he knelt in front of me, the expensive fabric of his trousers creasing on the rug. His mind, I could see, was racing to the only logical and terrible explanation. "Is it cancer? My God, Mom, is that it? You have a serious illness and you didn't tell me anything?" His voice was a terrified whisper, and in his eyes, I saw not Isabella's husband, but my boy, the little child who ran to me when he got hurt. The concern on his face was so real, so palpable, that a small part of my frozen heart began to thaw. He loved me. Somewhere, under all that luxury and ambition, he still loved me. As he helped me up, his hands firm on my arms, the small white card fell from my loose grasp and landed face up on the rug. Mateo's eyes followed its movement, his attention captured by the familiar, elegant handwriting. He sat me on the edge of the bed and bent down to pick up the note. I watched, breathless, as he read it. It was like watching the sun set and a storm gather in a matter of seconds. The confusion on his brow gave way to a paralyzed disbelief. His lips moved, rereading the words in silence. "Now you look sick." I saw a tremor start in his hand. "At least it matches your old soul." His knuckles turned white as he clenched the paper. "Don't ruin my wedding." And then the transformation happened. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a deathly pallor that was soon stained by a dark, angry red that climbed up his neck. His jaw clenched so tightly I could hear his teeth grinding. The perfectly controlled man vanished, and in his place emerged something primitive, a fury so pure and incandescent that it frightened me. He looked from the note to me, to my shaved head, and in his eyes, I saw the fog of denial that had blinded him for years being consumed by the fire of truth. He saw everything, every little humiliation, every cutting word, every look of contempt he had chosen to ignore, all culminating in that act of barbarism. The guilt hit him like a wave, a physical force that made him stagger backward. He looked at his own hands, then at me, and the horror on his face was that of a man who has just recognized himself as an accomplice to a heinous crime. "I allowed this," he whispered, his voice hoarse with self-recrimination. "I saw the signs, and I did nothing." He then knelt before me, the great architect, the man of success, reduced to a penitent son. He took my hands, and the tears I could not cry now streamed down his face. "Forgive me, Mom," he said, his choked voice breaking my heart. "My God, forgive me for every time I looked the other way, for every time I let her diminish you to build me up. Forgive my cowardice." The sincerity in his voice was the most real thing I had felt in that house since I first set foot in it. He wasn't just apologizing, he was confessing. He kissed my hands and then stood, his pain solidifying into a cold, terrifying determination. He carefully folded the note and placed it in the inner pocket of his jacket, next to his heart. "I was blind, Mom," he said, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "But I swear on Dad's memory. I swear on your life. This ends today." He turned and walked toward the door, no longer like a sheep going to the slaughter, but like a wolf going to protect its young. I followed him to the door, my heart beating a symphony of fear and hope. I watched him descend the marble staircase, each step firm and deliberate. The music of the harp floated up from the garden, an ethereal and romantic melody that created a bizarre soundtrack for what was to come. From the top of the stairs, I could see a part of the scene set up on the lawn, rows of white chairs, arches of flowers, and the guests, a sea of pastel colors and false smiles. I could see Isabella at the makeshift altar, a vision in white, her veil floating gently, the picture of perfection and purity. She was looking impatiently toward the house, her expression softening into a radiant smile when she finally saw Matteo appear. He did not look at her. His eyes were fixed on the justice of the peace who was waiting, and he walked down that aisle of flowers not as a groom going to meet his love, but as an executioner marching toward a sentencing. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled my soul and made the blood run faster in my veins, that the words that would come from my son's mouth would not be vows of love for her. They would be words of fire and of justice. "We would like to feel your presence in this very moment. Please write in the comments which city you are watching from and what time it is there now. By doing this, we create a network of energy and support for this story, a reminder that we are not alone in our battles. Each comment is a point of light in our healing process." From upstairs, I couldn't hear the exact words, but I could feel the shockwave that emanated from the garden. Later, Matteo told me every detail of that moment. He told me how the justice of the peace smiled, beginning the ceremony with words about union and love, and how he, my son, raised his hand to interrupt him. A silence fell over the guests as he took the small note from his jacket pocket. With a firm voice that resonated through the sound system, he did not read a poem or a vow, but Isabella's cruel sentence, word for word. "Now you look sick. At least it matches your old soul. Don't ruin my wedding." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. People looked at each other, smiles frozen on their faces, the high society charade dissolving in real time. It was then that Isabella, realizing she had lost control, went on the attack. He described how her face, once a mask of bridal perfection, contorted into an ugly, desperate fury. She screamed, accusing me of being a senile, manipulative old woman, of having shaved my own head and written the note to ruin her day. But the lie was so absurd, so hysterical, that it only served to confirm her guilt. Matteo waited for her to finish her delusional tirade, and, with a calm that cut deeper than any scream, he spoke into the microphone the words that sealed her fate. The only madness. "Here was my letting you hurt the most important person in my life. My mother gave me everything. You only took from me. We're done." He dropped the microphone. The dull thud of it hitting the grass was the sound of the final period. As chaos erupted in the garden below, Isabella's screams, her father's fury, the shocked buzz of guests rising from their chairs, my son turned his back on it all. He turned and walked back to the house, leaving behind the woman he almost married and the future of, wealth and status she represented. Every step he took toward me was a step away from the lie, and a step toward the truth. I waited for him at the top of the marble staircase, my heart a frightened bird beating against my ribs. When our eyes met, I needed no words. I saw in his face the pain of regret, but also an immense, overwhelming sense of relief, like a man who has just been rescued from a shipwreck. He climbed the last few steps and, without saying anything, wrapped me in his arms. It was a hug that healed years of silence and distance. I felt his tears on my shoulder and squeezed him with all the strength I had left, silently forgiving him for his blindness, for his weakness, for everything. He pulled away, holding my face in his hands, and said the words I had waited so long to hear, the words that meant my liberation. "Let's get out of here, Mom. Forever." And in that moment, I knew we had survived. We had nothing, but we had each other. And that was everything. Our departure was not dramatic. It was quiet, swift, and final. As the sounds of the social catastrophe continued in the garden, we went to my room. I refused the designer luggage, the expensive clothes that had never felt like mine. I took a cloth bag and placed inside the few things that still connected me to who I was. A yellowed photograph of Santiago and me on our wedding day, my old silver thimble that had belonged to my mother, and the small statue of Saint Rita of Cascia, the saint of impossible causes, which had always been on my nightstand. They were treasures with no monetary value, but they held the full weight of my history and my faith. Mateo took nothing but his wallet and his car keys. There was nothing for him in that house that was truly his. We descended the grand staircase hand in hand, passing confused staff who averted their gaze, unsure how to react. We crossed the foyer, with its overpriced flower arrangements and its cold, abstract art, and opened the front door. The high, Texas sunlight bathed us, and it seemed brighter than ever. We didn't look back. The heavy sound of the mansion door closing behind us was not a sound of loss, but of liberation. It was the door of our prison closing forever, and before us was the entire world, a future that was uncertain, but our own. In the months that followed, we rebuilt our life from the rubble. We rented a small 2-bedroom apartment in a working-class neighborhood, a place that vibrated with the sounds of real life. Children playing in the street, Latin music escaping through windows, the smell of home cooking in the air. That apartment, with its thin walls and second-hand furniture, was more of a home than the mansion had ever been. We painted the walls together, laughing when paint splattered on our faces. We went to flea markets, finding little treasures to fill our space. Mateo, free from the influence of Isabella's family, left his job at the large firm and found a position at a smaller architectural office, a place where his talent was what mattered, not his name by marriage. He would come home tired, but with a light in his eyes I hadn't seen in years. We cooked together, simple meals that tasted of our childhood, and we talked for hours, rediscovering each other, healing the wounds with the only things that truly mattered: time, attention, and unconditional love. For the first time in a long time, I fell asleep without fear and woke up in peace, in a house where the silence was not oppressive, but serene. My own resurrection began with the familiar hum of my old Singer sewing machine, which Mateo rescued from the storage unit where it had been forgotten. I set it up near the living room window, where the morning light streamed in, and I felt as if a part of me that had been dormant had awakened. I started slowly, doing small repairs for the neighbors. Soon, word spread, and orders began to come in. A dress for a baptism, new curtains for an elderly lady, the tailoring of a suit for a young man going to his first job interview. Every stitch I made was an act of reclaiming my identity. The money I earned was little, but it was mine. Earned with my talent, with the skill of my hands. I was no longer a burden, an extra mouth to feed. I was Carmen, the seamstress, a woman with a craft, a purpose. The women of the neighborhood would come for fittings and end up staying for coffee, sharing their stories with me. I was weaving not just fabrics, but a new community, a network of affection and respect. In that mansion, I was a ghost haunting the halls of a life that was not mine. In this small apartment, surrounded by thread, fabric, and the sound of real life, I was finally the master of my own life,